I'm very glad I can present my research in the context of the FERBOPO talks. As a little caveat, let me introduce my discipline, which is purely anthropological. The research I've been conducting is anthropological research with bits and dots of other disciplines next to it. But since I know anthropologists are not as much represented in your research group, maybe this will help introducing my presentation better. Let me first share my PowerPoint, which should work. Okay, and if you don't interrupt me, I trust that everything is going as it should. The picture you see here it comes from Ploiești and has been taken by Bucharest-based photograph and architect Marius Vasile, who has collaborated with me in a recent project called 30 Years, 30 Cathedrals. I'm going to talk about this later on, but we have just organized an exhibition on contemporary Orthodox Romanian architecture in Rome that lasted just a few days within the European Academy of Religion conference. And I thought this picture was a good compromise between communist past and the last 3-4 decades of Orthodox infrastructure in Romania. Actually, this is not entirely representative because this church has an interesting story. One of these two bell towers was built, exactly this one, in the 1930s designed by Thomas Ocolescu, but then this has been added later on in the 1990s. And so it's an interesting compromise, not just between communism and post-communism, but even part of the interwar period, which I think helps us understand what happens today in relation with the adoption of specific nationalist tendencies within the Orthodox Church. Lavinia was kind to remind my monographs. It's actually just one that came out in English a few years ago with Berghahn books, and that has been translated and launched 2 years ago by Polirom. And I'm really grateful that the Society for Romanian Studies took seriously my research and agreed with me on organizing this translation. And I'm really also a big debt of gratitude to anthropologist Simeon Pop, who went through the editing of the translation. Laszlo Locigare, who is here with us today, also was present during the launch of this book, and I'm really glad that he's here with us today again. So these are going to be the 3 topics I'm going to quickly discuss today. One is the ethnography of the National Cathedral in Bucharest, which you all know, that has been inaugurated last October. Then the project I just mentioned before, which is an attempt to popularize contemporary Romanian Orthodox architecture outside academia using visual and multimedia methods. And in the end, talking a few minutes about what happens with Orthodox monasteries, which is also an interesting yet, in my personal view, under discussed topic. Before telling you what's my theoretical approach, I would like to share a few numbers that you may or may not know about how extraordinary is this church building industry in Romania. First of all, if we consider all the 18 religious groups that are recognized by the State Secretariat for Religious Affairs, we are talking about over 10,000 houses of worship built after 1990, among which more than 4,000 are built by the Romanian Orthodox Church. And you might think, well, that's not that much, considering that the Romanian Orthodox Church represents more than 80% of the religious population. But 36 cathedrals, and the number of these 36 is debatable, we're going to talk about this later, are what helps understand this phenomenon, the Romanian Orthodox Church has built several houses of worship, but has concentrated more on or I wouldn't say quality, but on magnitude rather than on quantity. And so has built many cathedrals throughout the country to a pace that, to my knowledge, is unprecedented in the rest of the post-socialist bloc. And here you have the data I report from 2015, when the last report by the State Secretariat for Religious Affairs showed who is building what in Romania. And it's interesting to see how, in terms of quantity, it's rather Pentecostal churches and Baptists that have been building many churches. But these are small neighborhood churches that helps understand why 2% of the population, if we talk about the Pentecostals, own 10% of the houses of worship. As I said, the Romanian Orthodox Church, which is the main religious group I deal with in my research and I know better, has built less in terms of quantity, but imposing churches that require a huge amount of money. And this money is both public and private and varies according from case to case. What I always thought inspiring in my research was trying to think of religious architecture as a sort of lens through which reading post-socialist change. And the will of the post-socialist epoch in Romania, as the construction of the National Cathedral was the most prominent major work realized since 1990, is what I'm trying to find out by zooming on the religious infrastructure. And I'm quoting here a famous modernist architect, German architect, Mies van der Rohe, knowing how much of modernist heritage is there in Bucharest, I thought it was a good connection. And so this was my starting point. I've been researching this topic ever since I started my PhD, and which it's been already 12 years by now. When I heard that a huge cathedral was being built right next to the symbol of communist Romania, that was such an evident contrast that was worthy a PhD project. And then things get out of my control, and here we are again, 12 years later. And as I said, there is the work of anthropologists of religion that have been orienting my gaze. First of all, having in mind a specific definition of religion as capable of playing an expedient role in the process of forging a new governing and moral order, as described by Kathy Wenner, who is an anthropologist of religion doing extensive research in Ukraine since the late 1990s, and a religion that does so through mechanism of purification and compensation. And here another famous name in the anthropology of religion, and even more so of post-socialist studies in anthropology, Catherine Vergery, comes to my mind. Within this broad theoretical approach, I always defended the idea that we should privilege continuities over narratives of break, and trying to see what is actually in continuation during communism and after it. And the nationalist rhetoric is probably the most evident, but even the populist one, if we look at the names of the cathedral and the House of the People, no? Cathedrala Mântuirii Neamului and Casa Poporului. Clearly, Popor and Neam have two different nuances, and Popor is more related to work and a specific kind of identification that relates to class struggle, for instance. Neam has rather a relation of kin and body that relates to the people. And among the methods I've been using, I've been doing extensive fieldwork in Bucharest, but combining a long-term stay in Bucharest with several road trips around Romania that are more recent to report on new cathedrals and monasteries throughout the country. And I've been, of course, conducting structured interviews with clerics, theologians, technical experts, but also civil servants, activists, journalists, and artists. And I've been doing lots of participant observation, which is the main instrument of research among anthropologists. But I have also been using archival material, some of which I will show you later, doing some mapping and some journalist-like work when trying to figure out how much of this national cathedral was paid by state money and how much it was not. And this was happening even before important media outlets like Safia Lumina and other independent journalists started researching this topic. Because obviously I couldn't rely on the interviews I took with Orthodox priests in Bucharest in 2015. They would tend to tell me that the National Cathedral was mostly built with donations coming from the faithful, but you know better than me that when you do social sciences and this kind of research, you have to double check, let's say, the information you get. I know this picture is not at all updated, but I have an attachment to this. I didn't take this picture, of course, but I like the hectic feeling it gives with all these cranes around this hotbed of religious infrastructure, right? And of course, the House of the People in the background. And this project, you see on the right, the model of the cathedral, which I actually found in the subsol, in the underground of the cathedral when I was given a tour by the engineers. And there were several possible realities, because the pictures you see, the reflections next to the model, are actually other cathedrals that participated to the competition in the late 2000s. And all this model was stored in the underground when I visited it. And I thought it was an interesting metaphor to show what was and what could have been otherwise. What will be, sorry, and what could have been. I'm not going to linger on what's going to be in the cathedral. I guess most of you know well enough the details of this construction. I'll just linger on the fact that the location of it is particularly relevant because it's in a hub. And I'm talking maybe to those who know a little bit less Bucharest. It's in a hub of power, clearly, not just the House of the People, now Palace of the Parliament, but the Ministry of Defense, the Romanian Academy of Science. Strada Sabinelor is not belonging to any hub of power. It's just when I was when I was doing my research. It's close enough to have a stroll every day and see what was the feeling next to the cathedral. But just to say that the centrality of the cathedral is not just visual, but it's also oral, because the bells can reach up to 15 kilometers of range. So it's about having a dominance that is not just on the visual landscape, but also on every possible sort of sensorial activity. As you know better than me, Orthodox cathedrals would be best located on top of a hill, so that not just they are closer to the sky and to God, but they also have a position of privilege in the urban environment or in the rural one. And while doing participant observation, this is the chapel next to the then under construction main part of the complex. In this chapel, there is a charismatic priest that is preaching. It has been more than 10 years now. His name is Ciprian Gardinaru, and he was sent by his superiors, by the hierarchs of the Romanian Patriarchate, from the monastery of Sihastria to Bucharest to start creating a community. As you know, that area is an area that was devoted to the systematization of Ceausescu in the 70s and the 80s. So a few churches had been actually destroyed, and ideally hierarchs and the patriarch himself thought that it would have been good to have a good preacher and a charismatic priest that would be able to create a sense of community in that area while the cathedral was being built. And this was just a side project that I found interesting to see how the activation of charisma can be used to reinforce a specific order, not just to challenge the powers that be, as Max Weber would argue. I also be brief about what made this cathedral controversial, because again, the public today is mostly Romanian. But first is the name, and I'm not sure if all of you noticed that there has been a subtle change in the label used by the Romanian Patriarchate and all the media that it controls, be it Basilica, Trinitas, and so on. At first, the name of this cathedral was Cathedrala Manturini Amului. It was firstly adopted in 1920, and it has been dominant until the 2010s, the early years of 2010, when the name was progressively changed into National Cathedral. My personal guess, I might be wrong, is that there was an issue with, let's say, the risk of being called nationalist, if not even ethnophilatist, because you cannot reach, according to Canons and Orthodox theology itself, you cannot reach salvation as a group of people, but just individually. Even more so when this group of people is ethnically characterized, right? Because the Neam is the Neam Romanesque. And so the idea was rather that one to build a national cathedral, which has a less theologically controversial name, but rather, as the former spokesperson Constantin Noica, the idea was to create what was already there in the Vatican with St. Peter or St. Paul in London and the Stephan's Dome in Vienna and so forth. Whether this was actually achieved, it can be discussed, of course. First of all, because of the architecture. All the major unions of architects, for instance, Soare, have criticized the combination of different architectural styles and material, which is called pastiche in the architectural jargon. And this happened because the winning proposal, which was the one of company Van Alexim, based in Baku, which has also built the cathedral in Baku, basically followed which were the requirements by the Romanian Patriarchate. And so blending some references to Byzantine sacred architecture with Neo-Romanian and more local vernacular aspects. When you do this using new materials to recreate old forms, that's a no-go in architectural terms. And this is the reason why the idea of building an heritage for the future would be highly contested by experts. And last but not least, obviously, the financing. Let me remind you that it's not just about the construction itself, but also the land where the cathedral is rising, as it is the case in all the other cathedrals I've been researching, at least most of them. A new cathedral raises on a plot of land that is often donated, a few times by privates, much more often by the local town hall. And this means that these constructions are actually very heavy on the financial point of view. And my research in the book, I've mentioned before, stopped to 2018. But of course, year after year, the sum of money has been growing. And now we're talking about, if my memory doesn't fail me, over 300 million euros by now. But I might not be entirely updated about this. And most of this money have come from public coffers. I'm talking about the Bucharest Cathedral. So clearly, for part of the population, this was problematic, considering that the budget allocated for educational purposes and for the health system is among the lowest within the European Union. You might remember what happened after Collective, this sad moment that actually brought many people to the street and transformed a strictly political struggle and protest into an anti-clerical one. And I was lucky in terms of research to be there and to do fieldwork right when this happened in Bucharest. And I remember taking this picture with Presbyterian Cathedral just sticked to a window in Cale Victoriei, sorry, in Boulevard Magheru. When I was mentioning the help of archival resources, I was thinking of this, and namely to the fact that, interestingly enough, the money that King Carol envisaged for the realization of the Cathedral in Bucharest in the early 1880s were 1 decade later redirected to public education. What would happen more than 140 years ago wouldn't happen now, right? So it's exactly the Presbyterian Cathedrale controversy, but in the 19th century. And I'm not sure I should tell you more about which exactly are the laws regulating the fact that the cathedral should always receive financing until it's actually over with its construction, because specific laws were promulgated to make sure that there is a constant flow of money and the Cathedral of Bucharest doesn't end up like the cathedral in Craiovizza Nova, which I will show you very soon, which is an impressive construction that has been now left unconstructed for several years. This is just to show you how much the industry of religious infrastructure have been growing from 1990 up to 2018. And if I had updated data, I would be very curious to see them. But unfortunately, the State Secretariat for Religious Affairs hasn't released a new report since 2015, which is very sad because it's the kind of data that it would be impossible to gather otherwise. There you go. This is the cathedral in Craiovizza Nova. It clearly still has some sort of brutalist, late communist style. It was its construction started in the early 1990s, but hasn't been finalized yet. And I and Marius thought this would be a good picture for the poster of our exhibition that just ended in Rome. We are confident we will make a bigger one in Bucharest next year and possibly even in other Romanian cities. And this is the occasion to remind you that when I'm talking about the 36 cathedrals built by the Romanian Orthodox Church, I use the criteria that in anthropology we called EMIC. That is, it wasn't my definition of a cathedral. I wouldn't be entitled. I went through the documents I was able to find published by the Romanian Patriarchate and checked where cathedrals were financed in the last decades, only within Romania. There are others abroad, but I didn't include this in this specific project. And obviously, not all of these cathedrals actually house the seat of an eparchy, but some of these are simply particularly important churches in their area. They're particularly big or relevant. And since they are called cathedrals by the Romanian Patriarchy, I decided to keep the same criteria. If we had to talk about strictly houses, seats of an eparchy, they would be less than 36, probably half of them. But that wouldn't help us understand the width of this process. After 1990, new eparchies have been opened. Some of them were actually closed during socialism. But not just they were reopened, others were opened anew from scratch. And you know that when you have a new eparchy, you actually need a new seat of the bishop or the archbishop. And this was one of the reasons why in Romania we have so many cathedrals distributed all over the country. It is by there is a reason why there are less in Transylvania, and that reason is that one way to homogenize Greater Romania was to build cathedrals in the 1930s and in the interwar period, already exactly in those areas where there was a higher rate of ethnic and religious heterogeneity. So Cluj-Napoca, Timișoara are examples that had cathedrals built in that period. And imagine, the only cathedral built under communist times was the one in Sfântu Gheorghe for allegedly very similar reasons, right? So pinpointing as Orthodox an area that is actually very contested and contended by different ethnic and religious minorities. And so what we did was having a fantastic road trip all over the points you see here marked, which was an excuse to discover this country. Years and years again, I've seen a few of these cities before, and it was really surprising for me to see how fast Romania is changing. And this is not about my presentation; it's just something I'm sharing with you. It was actually a fantastic journey that showed us also how much Orthodox contemporary architecture is changing, which is fascinating to notice in a tradition-based religion, right? You know that the self-representation of the Romanian Orthodox Church is heavily based on tradition. And this is why it makes it interesting to see change while keeping this in mind. I'll show you a very quick teaser of our exhibition and then move on. And these are all cathedrals that we have surprised, captured with a drone from above. And just as a teaser for the exhibition, I really hope I'll be able to organize next year in Romania. These other cathedrals remind us that religious infrastructure isn't just a Romanian affair after the end of socialism. And you can see clockwise the church, the Christ the Savior Cathedral in Moscow, the new cathedral of the of the Russian armed forces outside of Moscow, the Temple of Divine Providence, which is a Catholic temple in Poland, and the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Tbilisi, in Georgia. So clearly, there is a comeback in terms of capacity to be able again to mark the public space by the major religious actors in these countries. And I do believe that it's important to read the phenomenon of these new Orthodox churches being built in Romania through the lens of similar enterprises in other post-socialist and post-Soviet countries. And interestingly enough, 3 of these 4, I wouldn't mention, but actually even the other cathedral in Moscow, they all refer to a sort of thanksgiving to God for some sort of achievement that has to be celebrated with the construction of a cathedral. The original idea of the Bucharest Cathedral in the late 1880s was to celebrate the independence from the Ottoman Empire. And so it was gaining victory against Napoleon for the 18th century Russia, although this cathedral was rebuilt after the Bolsheviks tore it down in the 1920s or 30. That's I'm not really sure. And the cathedral in Moscow, the other one of the Russian armed forces, is a constant reference to the great victory of May 1945 against the Nazis. And the one in Poland remembers as a Thanksgiving the first Polish constitution in 1791, and so forth. And even the one in Tbilisi has, as a reason of its construction, technically the celebration of 15 centuries since the establishment of the archbishopric of the autocephaly of the Georgian church. This is just to put things in a wider context and trying to understand how projects that are actually very old end up being constructed in a specific historical period, which is post-socialism, or post-Soviet, the post-Soviet era, which is a period of great ferment for religious actors, which is even more interesting considering how this is not the case in Western Europe, where churches are more and more redundant and in some cases are readapted for other migrant churches or even just repurposed for secularist uses. And there are a few aspects that I'm going to share with a few pictures that we noticed in this road trip we conducted with Marius Vasile. Not just the fact that the east-west orientation isn't as followed as we might think. It's not an imperative that has to be used at all costs. Very often, the urbanistic and urban planning principle is more important than this east-west orientation. And so many of the cathedrals we have been visiting are actually not on an east-west axis, because they would fit better oriented towards a boulevard, for instance. But also the introduction of pews and churches, and chairs changed the way of living the liturgy and the mass. It has become more and more normal to have chairs in cathedrals and in churches. And this is a change. It wasn't the case before. And I think it's important to be aware also of how lived religion changes accordingly to the change of the sacred space. The usage of mosaics, which is again in a huge revival, and in this sense, probably the Bucharest Cathedral set a standard. And so other cathedrals that are being built in more slowly than the Bucharest Cathedral, because they obviously have less fund at disposal, would still want to have the same icon painter that was in Bucharest. And when this is too expensive, they rather resort to other icon painters and mosaic experts as the one in Iași, Art Georgis, and so forth. And so iconographic and style options and choices are changing as well. And I think it's important to track record of this. This is the interior of the Gura Humorului Cathedral, which is a very interesting plan that is octagonal, which I haven't seen before, and this is the reason why I'm showing this to you. The first iconostasis with light within. And here we actually had the chance to interview the architect that planned this lively iconostasis, which uses onyx as a stone, which permits light to glow from inside. And you cannot see it from here, but even the cross and the altar have this light within. And this is unique achievement in Romania. There is no such iconostasis anywhere else. And it's an interesting combination of tradition and technological modernity, right? This is in Slatina. Sorry, I forgot you to tell. This is the church in Topoloveni. Technically, it's called Cathedral, and so we included it in our list. And is the only cathedral that is not on a land owned by the Romanian Topoloveni, the former House of Culture. And this means that, I'm quoting the priest we interviewed, if the mayor wants to kick us out tomorrow, he can, which is probably also the reason why next to the iconostasis, in front of it, there is a huge, beautiful portrait of the mayor of Topoloveni. So I invite you, for those who are not too far from it, to visit this unique place of worship, which was a former bookshop. I can't remember anymore. It was purely a secular building that has been converted into an house of worship. And here you see depictions as ctitor of a few of the priests that have built cathedrals here. We are in Vatradornei, and the priest is telling me why he chose this specific iconography and symbols. Here up, we are in Târgoviște, which is a very important city in medieval Romania. So you have all the rulers, the dominators, depicted next to God, to Christ Pantocrator. This picture was taken in Berghahn, and I think it's a unique one because it's taken from the altar. And as you know, only ordained priests have access to the altar. But since this cathedral was still under construction, Marius took a picture from a place he wouldn't be able otherwise to stomp on. And of course, these are places that may be controversial, but are also lived by Orthodox believers and faithful. Often, though, they are lived in the underground because when cathedrals are so big, they are also very expensive to pay maintenance, right, and the bills. And paradoxically, during the week and most of the time, people stay in the underground in the chapel at -1, and like the case of this woman who is praying again in Bratadorne. And the urban context is fundamental. So often we have been fascinated to see how the new cathedrals interact with the socialist heritage. Here on the right, you see Onești with the classic contribution of the civic center. So the House of Culture and the Hotel of Onești, and now a new page in history, in the post-socialist cathedral that has been built in a very beautiful square in Onești. And here on the left, Brăila, from above with the drone, you can see the whole setting of purely communist blocks that surrounds this cathedral. The role of technical experts, of icon painters, which I don't have, unfortunately, the time to tell you about. I'm gonna move on just to spend a few words on monasteries, but not before putting stress on the fact that religious infrastructure is among the most relevant enterprises of post-socialist Romania. And as I said, I think it's a valuable choice to look at this as a lens to understand how the country has been changing, because it was a priority in the public coffers of governments in the last 4 decades, regardless of their color, right? From social democrats to liberals, the money flowed for religious infrastructure nevertheless. And this has to tell us something. Maybe that indeed there is a religious revival among the population. My guess was personally a bit skeptical of this switch on, switch off in the life of believers. I think we can all agree on the fact that there has been continuity in basic religious education in Romania that has happened during communist times rather within the house walls in private, and that has again spilled over in the public place in the 1990s. So I would resist the temptation of talking of a religious revival and speak rather of an organizational revival. Because even if the Romanian Orthodox Church was not disbanded or was less affected than other religious groups, it was still heavily influenced, of course, ideologically in terms of theological seminaries being closed. So that's obvious that there was an institutional depression, and then since 1990s, all this have been started working again in terms of new media, in terms of new priests being coming out of new theological seminaries being opened, in terms of new monasteries being built. This is something I already told you before, so I'm gonna move on. And let me show you a few pictures. Look at this impressive building that is probably now close to conclusion at the Rohia Monastery. This is not an isolated case. Monasteries are expanding also because there is a growing popularity of religious tourism, sometimes even with excess. Like this building has almost 10 floors. It's in the very north of the country. And it bespeaks of the power of these sites that are able to attract funds that would otherwise be hardly attracted to a community that is supposed to live in sheer discontinuity to the urban environment, right? And this is not the case anymore. This is a picture that I took a few years ago from the adormition of the Theotokos, 15th of August in the Nicola Monastery after a pilgrimage that started from Gerla and arrived here. And it's called the Woodstock of pilgrimages, because indeed it's also just an opportunity for many faithful to have some sort of touristic experience or just some sort of distraction from their daily lives. And this was a fantastic moment to see this sort of electric castle, without the castle, but with this old Greek Catholic church that is now being replaced by a huge Orthodox church. So there is also a dynamic of replacement in a few monasteries in Transylvania. Obviously, Prislop, just look at how big the parking has become here, bottom right. And so obviously the Orthodox Church is well aware that monasteries are an important part of the expansion of the church after 1990. Again, from Terbent, you can see how it has been expanded. But I fear I'm talking a bit too much, so I'm just gonna end my presentation by reminding you of few buzzwords that I find useful to mention. One is what I described as a desecularization of property, provocatively inverting the 1863 secularization of church property promoted by Cusa. This religious infrastructure shows a tendency to offer state assets to the Romanian Orthodox Church. And this is why I use this provocative expression. And again, what I already said and defined as the organizational revival, which should be detached from what we tend to describe as a religious revival, which I don't think is a good label to describe Romania since 1990. And obviously a continuity in the nationalist rhetoric, in the canonizations that the Romanian Orthodox Church has promoted even very recently, last year. And obviously the convenience of an anti-communist rhetoric that is the political currency that has been dominated. Now it's probably less relevant, of course, but in the 90s and 2000 was used even by those who were themselves parts of the Communist Party or were apparatchik or you name it, informator, whatever it is. And I would like to thank you for your attention with this picture from the Baia Mare Cathedral, which I find really astonishing, is the cupola of the under construction cathedral in Baia Mare. And yeah, thank you so much for your attention.